Hi everyone, hola a todos, bienvenidos. Diana with Somos Un Pueblo Unido. We are a statewide racial and economic justice organization across the state of New Mexico. We have 7 offices across the state, and we're about to open our 8th office in Artesia, New Mexico. So we're very excited for that. We currently have an office in Hobbs and Roswell, and so we invite you all to come visit us over there. And so we're also the only organization in the state of New Mexico, although it feels like for the rest of the country, that organizes immigrant oil and gas workers, specifically here in Southeastern New Mexico. And so we began our Just Transition campaign a few years ago, back in 2019, which was led solely with and by workers, which has led us to this moment to speak on a report, a project we've been working on with our communities, our familias from Southeastern New Mexico over a year. And so as many of you may know, immigrant and Latinos make up nearly 46% of the state's oil and gas workforce, contributing over 40% to the state's revenue. And so although we're big contributors to the state's economy, we are often the most underserved and ignored communities in the region, if not the state. And so as the state begins to plan to diversify the economy and execute a just transition, we want to make sure that we are not left behind. And so we partnered with UNM Center for Social Policy to conduct a study with immigrant oil and gas workers who were either directly connected or indirectly connected with the oil industry. And so we heard around some working conditions, but also some of the experiences of the immigrant workforce in Southeastern New Mexico. And we also covered a Southeastern workforce development landscape analysis, which covered some of the social and structural barriers that our communities continue to face to access quality jobs, and also a workforce development programs within a just transition. And so we take a just transition very seriously, and so I'd like to share with you all a definition of a just transition that we really like. And so here it goes. A just transition seeks to ensure that no people, workers, places, sectors, countries, or regions are left behind in the move from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. And so today we have researchers Dr. Gabriel Sanchez, and Dr. Shannon Sanchez Youngman, who will speak more on those key findings, those structural barriers that we mentioned, and also those policy recommendations. And so take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully folks can see the PowerPoint presentation well.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm Gabe Sanchez. I'll be co-presenting this presentation with my close colleague, Dr. Shannon Sanchez Youngman. We are both affiliated with UNM Center for Social Policy. By way of introduction, that entity at UNM intends to coordinate applied policy research across a wide range of policy issue areas important to the state of New Mexico, including the potential transition to clean energy and the workforce dynamics associated with that transition. Before I begin, I'll just thank a number of research assistants that supported this work: Melanie Sayuri Dominguez, Jordan Tafoya, Gabriel Martinez, and Yaslin Cordova. Thank you for all of the work you put in the collection of the data, as well as putting together the report. And just thank Somos, who's been one of our closest and most trusted partners throughout a long range of research, really focused on including the voices of Latino and immigrants across a wide range of public policy issue areas, including immigration and what we'll talk about today, the oil and gas industry. So let me tell you a little bit about the research questions, or the purpose of the report that we conducted, that you'll be hearing a bit about in the presentation that Shannon and I will provide for you today. We wanted to, first and foremost, understand the attitudes, experiences, and workplace conditions of specifically the Latino oil and gas workforce, as well as their families. Their spouses were included in a lot of our interview conversations, specifically in the Southeastern New Mexico Permian Basin. So a couple of things I want to highlight right out the gate. We specifically focused on the Latino workforce because not only, as Diana noted at the beginning, do they comprise a much larger share of the overall oil and gas workforce in New Mexico than folks often recognize, but we also wanted to specifically look at that population because they're often not included in policy discussions related to anything related to workforce development. So ensuring that we had their voice, and particularly the immigrant segment of the Latino workforce in oil and gas, was a very specific and nuanced focus of this research. We also focused specifically on the Permian Basin. Again, not only is this one of the drivers of oil and gas revenue in the state of New Mexico, in fact, that generates almost all of the oil and gas revenue for the state of New Mexico. But while New Mexico, unfortunately, has experienced very stagnant growth over time, almost flat and in some counties decreased population, in the counties that we focused on in this research, those are the only areas that we actually have seen population increases over time. So that motivates, again, a focus specifically on that area of the state of New Mexico. We wanted to look at the community's current and long-term training needs, not only to look at the long-term training needs, as we all know, this transition to clean energy is going to take some time. And I know many folks might be saying, well, why do we need to work on this now if it's going to take better part of maybe a decade to see full implementation? And the obvious answer is, if we don't start focusing on the infrastructure needs now, this train is unfortunately going to miss a wide segment of New Mexico's population who won't access these jobs in emerging industries. So it's important to look at this research now so the state and other stakeholders can begin preparing for the increased demand of workforce training as clean energy starts to take off in the state of New Mexico. We also, however, want to look at current workforce dynamics, specifically in the oil and gas industry. This isn't going anywhere immediately. So looking at workforce conditions, the needs and priorities of the workers now is also a priority of this research. And finally, we wanted to describe the strengths and challenges of the current training landscape in the Permian Basin, drawing from the experiences and perceptions of local educators, workforce boards, and community organizations that we spoke with. In fact, we spoke with 30 different folks across the Permian Basin who provide service provision, whether it be GED training, other workforce development training. We wanted to make sure we actually got a very detailed landscape of what is available to workers now, as well as what might be on the horizon as demand for added workforce training increases into the future as we start to see the transition to clean energy. I don't want to talk extensively about our methodology, but for any reporters or other researchers that are participating today, you can definitely feel free to contact me directly if you want to hear more about the methodological approach that we took with the study. But this is in line with all of the Center for Social Policy's research that is community-based and participatory research focused, meaning rather than us as researchers parachuting into a community and trying to collect information, we partner directly with organizations like Somos Un Pueblo Unido, who already have deep connections, deep trust with members of this specific community in Southeastern New Mexico. So we appreciate Somos, your really strong support in helping us connect with community and making sure that the questions that we put in front of members of the community have traction with what you all are seeing on the ground every day, working with these families and the workforce and the other members of the community. At the end of the day, we talked to 67 individuals across 7 focus groups. These were based in Hobbs, Roswell, and Artesia, and were conducted over essentially the span of 2 seasons, spring and winter of 2023. And all of our work, both the survey that was professionally guided with 96 respondents and the focus groups, were fully bilingual, with most participants actually participating either bilingually in English and Spanish or in Spanish. So ensuring that our research team had that capacity was necessary because of the specific focus of Latino members of the workforce and their families, many of which preferred to conduct the research in Spanish. We also leveraged survey data of young adults that our team conducted with BSP Research, a national survey firm that conducts a lot of research in New Mexico. We isolated the young adults from Lee, Chavez, and Eddy counties, gave us a little bit over 200 respondents. That survey focused specifically on the interests of young adults in jobs in emerging industries and what workforce training they might want available to them. And then finally, as I noted, we also conducted 30 interviews with service providers across the Permian Basin that provide workforce development and other basic training like GED or language training and English skills. So very robust research that was intended to be comprehensive, specifically of oil and gas workers in the Permian Basin region. So jumping right into the findings, one of the major themes that we really focused on with the overall report excuse me, my computer jumped back on me. One of the major things that we focused on were the working conditions of oil and gas industry workers. Many of you on this call already know that oil and gas are the least regulated industries in the state of New Mexico. And unfortunately, as our report reinforces from prior work done in this area, this has led to very dangerous working conditions for members of the oil and gas workforce. We unfortunately found a lot of examples of working conditions that are way too dangerous, with accidents being way too common. For example, you see on this pie graph in front of you, when we asked members of the workforce in our survey directly if they have been witness to any accidents or unfortunately seen anybody pass away due to accidents on the job, you see very high response rates. Almost 60% of the oil and gas workers that we surveyed indicated that they know someone who has had an accident on the job. And unfortunately, almost 14% of those incidents resulted in somebody actually seeing a casualty as a result specifically of the accident that they incurred while working in the oil and gas industry. Other main finding, if we think about the working conditions of oil and gas industry workers, very long hours are common. In fact, one of the modal number of hours per week that we saw from respondents was 80-hour work weeks for a large segment of the workforce, and really clarifying a very strong perception or myth about oil and gas workers is that although many of these folks make very high wages, this is a direct result of almost all members of the workforce we talked to participating in overtime. So it was really the overtime driving their high wages. And in fact, when we looked at the data, a large segment of the workforce, including most of the women in the workforce, do not make anywhere near the high six-figure wages that I think are often associated with this workforce. In fact, a sizable segment of that particular segment of the workforce indicated they make $25,000 or less annually. So again, making sure we understand it's not just the working conditions of the oil and gas industry today that need attention, but recognizing although a large segment of the workforce do make large wages, and that's a main driver for a lot of these workers continuing to work in oil and gas despite the very dangerous conditions and long overtime that's required, but not all of the members of the workforce make that high levels of wages. We also found that there's very uneven and limited access to employment benefits for a large segment of Latino members of the oil and gas industry. In fact, although this is very much a workforce that recognizes there's boom and bust periods, unfortunately, nearly 70%, 68% of everybody that we spoke with in the survey indicated that over the last 5 years, they've either been laid off or had their hours significantly cut back when there's periods of no longer need for the high demand of oil and gas production. But of those 68% who indicated that they've been laid off or had their hours cut back, a robust 78% indicated that they lack access to unemployment insurance. So increasing access to unemployment insurance for all members of the oil and gas workforce is going to be vital, given that we have experienced just in the last couple of years large segments of this workforce needing unemployment insurance and not being able to access it when there were difficult economic periods specific to this industry. We also found very limited access to other employment benefits, including health insurance or paid sick leave. So not only do we need to think about ensuring that these stopgaps are available to workers as we transition to clean energy jobs, but hopefully we can do something about this now so that oil and gas industry workers don't have to spend their work days with these long and dangerous conditions with low levels of access to safety net policies that many of us take for granted, like unemployment insurance and health insurance. Another major theme of this report was looking at the perceptions and needs specifically of workers. So just an overall summary before I jump into some specifics with some data points to reinforce these overall themes. We found that workers recognize that their employment is unsustainable and unreliable. Many of these folks told us directly they're aware that oil and gas and fossil fuels overall in New Mexico is coming to an end, and there will be a transition to clean energy jobs. This is a motivator for many to really find workforce development training. They recognize their days might be numbered in this industry, and they're very hungry for opportunities to find training to move into other areas of the workforce. Nearly all respondents, as a very positive finding from the study, want to stay in the Permian Basin where they have raised their families, but many are worried that their jobs won't be replaced in the transition to clean energy that will allow them to continue living in a region that they call home. Workers and their spouses are very willing to participate in training, as you'll see from some of the findings that I'll break out for you, even, and this is really important, if that requires traveling away from the region. However, we'll identify many barriers and obstacles that will need to be addressed to ensure that an increased demand for workforce development training, as we see this transition to clean energy, can actually be met with resources in the region. So let's look at some of the specifics within this overall theme. Again, job training and workforce development overall was a major theme of the overall research that we conducted. Very positively, literally 100% of respondents, every single person that we talked to, indicated that they would participate in job retraining programs if, and this is critical, if they were free and had convenient hours and locations to make them able to participate fully in retraining programs. When we look specifically at what type of training that would prepare them for jobs outside of the oil and gas industry were attractive to them. You see in the bar chart in front of you that there was a wide range of different areas of training that folks would be interested in. The modal, or most commonly identified, was at 47% online courses that they could take on their own schedules and allow them to not have to vacate their current existing positions in the oil and gas industry. We also found that 37% identified that on-the-job training and apprenticeship programs would be highly valued. In our prior work we did with Workforce Solutions and Somos Un Pueblo Unido and a number of other community partners, we found that specific to solar industry, on-the-job training and apprenticeship programs were critical for success in those industries. So seeing that over a third of the workforce in oil and gas would be interested in on-the-job training and apprenticeship programs is a very important finding that suggests that there will be a direct match for what's needed in clean energy, as well as what the state could provide and what the workforce is actually willing to accommodate. We also found that 32% in-person classes at a community college or training center, specifically near their community, would be highly valued. And 37%, an important finding indicating that English language classes offered during normal work hours would be highly valued. So at the end of the day, what's needed is a varied or braided set of workforce training options that provide the opportunity to meet oil and gas workers and their families where they're at. The fact that we saw 37% of folks indicate that just basic English language classes would be necessary points to the fact that there needs to be not only more focused and narrowly defined workforce development training, but basic skill training in English, as well as computer programming or just basic computer skills, in order to make sure that all members of the workforce can participate fully in workforce development training that might be conducted online and may only be available in English. When we looked at what types of programs or services members of the oil and gas workforce and their families would like to see happen to train them and their families in growing industries in the region, you see high support and interest in manufacturing jobs, whether at 50% of the overall population, noting that these manufacturing jobs could be specific to renewable energy, such as weatherization training, wind turbine manufacturing training, etc., or broader training for jobs in manufacturing, such as welding, electrician-oriented skills. You see that a lot of those skill sets are what members of the oil and gas workforce already have some training in and would like to see expanded opportunities so that they can get the needed certification to pursue well-paying jobs in those industries. But we also see strong support for other aspects of training, whether that's just basic building and construction training, electrician, plumbers, carpentry, etc. These skill sets, again, that a lot of the members of the oil and gas workforce already have under their belt, but need advanced training and certification in, as well as HVAC training for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So you see that not only do we identify that there's overall strong interest in workforce development training among Latino oil and gas workers in the Permian Basin, but the report actually provides a blueprint for the state and other advocates to be able to figure out what infrastructure should be put in place now to make sure that the training available to workers actually matches the jobs and the industries that they're interested in getting training to be able to work in. When we look more specifically at what type of training might be required or necessary in order for members of the oil and gas workforce to be able to participate in, again, some very positive themes emerge from our data collection. First, you see that 78% of oil and gas workers and their families are willing to travel to access job and basic skills training outside of the Permian Basin. However, in order for that to happen, we found that the workforce will need to be compensated for their time away from their jobs to be able to participate in workforce development training. Many will need access to child support and may need support for travel and transportation, which remains a significant challenge for many. You see when we ask specifically what would they need in order to participate in job training, you see the specific numbers that reinforce that overall finding. At 77%, so definitely a key resource that will be needed. Folks indicated they would need supplemental income. As you see from the quotes that are provided here, we have to remind ourselves many of the oil and gas workforce are the sole income providers for their families. So it's not as though they can step away from their long jobs and participate, right, in training if it's not compensated to overcome, right, the loss of income that would be needed in order to participate in training. We also see living stipends, specifically if they're going to have to move to another county. We're going to need to find mechanisms to support not only themselves, but members of their family traveling away from home to participate in workforce development training, support with lodging and transportation. Right? So all of these things add up to the need to have full support and wraparound service needs, including, you see, nearly 78% of participants noted to us they would access childcare if it was available to participate in training. So you see a wide range of support resources are needed to be put in place in order to ensure that all members of the workforce and oil and gas industries can participate in workforce training. We wanted to look specifically at the prospect of web-based or virtual training as an option for members of the workforce. We know that thinking about web-based training is going to have to be necessary for the state of New Mexico, given the physical distance between Southeastern New Mexico counties, which our prior research with Workforce Solutions noted, unfortunately, does not have the same level of higher education-oriented training available in clean energy that other areas of the state further north have in abundance. So we wanted to really look at web-based training. Positively, you see that 71% of the workforce that we spoke with indicated they have regular and reliable access to high-speed internet to be able to participate in workforce training. So that's very positively, as well as the overwhelming majority of 85% of the workforce who indicated they have the underlying computer skills necessary to use the internet to find training opportunities and further their education or skill training. However, right, we know that New Mexico, unfortunately, suffers from some of the highest digital divide rates in the United States, and that was also borne out in what we found in our study. For example, 59% of oil and gas workers indicated that they lack access to a private and quiet space to complete online training at their home. And many, unfortunately, lack not only access to high-speed internet, but the computers and an overall technology like tablets at their home that would allow them to participate fully in overall workforce development that's exclusively conducted online. So although this is a great opportunity for a large segment of the workforce, we know there's going to be needed support resources to ensure that all members of the workforce have the computer skills and the overall infrastructure, including computers at home, to participate solely in digitally based workforce training. I also want to cover briefly, before I turn things over to my partner, Dr. Sanchez-Youngman, to talk a little bit about some of the other nuances and policy recommendations of our report, that in the research that we conducted with interviews of service providers in the region who offer workforce and education training, a number of different obstacles were identified in those conversations that we had with folks. Very positively, I'll start with all 30 individuals that we spoke with. Was clear to us they understand the valuable role that they play in providing workforce development training to members of the region. They're excited about the opportunities on the horizon to train more folks, but all extensively noted They recognize that they have severe limitations and what they can provide to members of the workforce and others in the region. And every single person that we spoke with indicated they need more resources, more funding, and more overall support from the state and others to make sure that they meet the current demand for workforce development training, as well as the expanded demand that they know is on the horizon as we transition away from oil and gas, into clean energy. Some specifics within this, we saw that GED and English language classes, fortunately, are widely available in the region, but lack flexibility to match the needs of the workforce and their families. A couple specifics there. Unfortunately, a large segment of the folks that we talked to indicated they don't have GED or ESL classes that are often available outside of traditional 8 to 5 business hours, which unfortunately, again, a large segment of the oil and gas workforce already have full-time jobs. So they're going to need to participate in these classes outside of traditional hours. We also found, unfortunately, low access points to childcare in the region. And I will say, not just with the programs that we spoke with, that very few have this resource of childcare available on their site, but many folks noted that overall in the region, even if you tried to find childcare through your own purposes, is very limited because of a lack of overall childcare workforce. So just thinking about not just specific to oil and gas workers, but expanding access to childcare overall for members of the Permian Basin would really help a lot of folks expand their overall workforce development training and their opportunities to get jobs with higher wages. And we also found that knowledge of funding available through ECECD, which actually does have some funding you can apply for to be able to support childcare access to participate in workforce development. Very few people were even aware that this funding existed. And so just expanding access to knowledge about the programs that are already available to folks would be something that I think is low-hanging fruit for stakeholders in the state to be able to expand. We also found that language, transportation, and digital divide issues are significant challenges. Many of the folks that we spoke with indicated that they recognize that transportation is a major challenge for many members of the workforce who have to travel long distances in order to participate in the workforce training that's available to them. But unfortunately, nobody has resources to support transportation challenges. Many of the folks that we spoke with know that many of the members of the community that need training need this done in Spanish. But again, many folks noted, unfortunately, they don't have the resources available to meet that demand right now, much less into the future. Finally, Title I and Title II WIOA resources that support a lot of the workforce development, GED, ESL training in the region are specifically limited only to U.S. citizens. So thinking about the state providing stopgap funding for these limitations to make sure that all members of the workforce, not just those that are U.S. citizens, is going to be vital as we move forward here in the state of New Mexico. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shannon, who will talk a bit about the experiences specific to women that were identified in the overall research, as well as our specific policy recommendations. Shannon, I believe you're on mute. You might have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. So just to round out the findings that we have for today, we just wanted to highlight some of the unique experiences of some of the women in the region. We were really lucky in this study. We talked to large numbers of women who were both working in oil fields and those that were working in industries that support this kind of work that includes things like working in restaurants nearby, or often cleaning in hotels that are supporting the industry. So of those women who work in the oil fields, what we're finding is that younger women who speak English are often participating in the workforce as administrative staff, and a growing portion of these women are working as welders. While women report that these jobs are providing a decent amount of wages, the conditions for women working in these both supportive industries and within the oil industry are very tough. What we commonly found is that women said that it was really hard for those who are actually working in the field doing work like welding, because these workforce situations were not set up for women to even be there. So they're often having to find a place to even go to the bathroom. Women say that it's good pay and long hours, but that the real challenge is that transportation getting to and from these jobs not only takes them away from their children, but given the lack of childcare resources in the region, women are really struggling to even keep a job because they have nowhere to take their kids. We also found that of those women who are working, who often work cleaning or waiting tables in restaurants, that they're feeling isolated, that their jobs are intermittent and they're subject to the booms and busts of the oil field, so that they are really fragile jobs that often come and go. Gabe, you can go forward. So given the amount of data that we presented for you today, we want to conclude our presentation by just offering a few recommendations that are coming from our report. Now, one thing that we did in our survey work is we asked members of the community whether they think their voices are being heard in the current policy solutions that are happening in New Mexico. And as this graph shows you here, oil workers really feel that although they're committed and have been longtime members of local communities and have worked for years in the region, that essentially their voices aren't being heard in policy solutions. As you see here, 77% of our participants said that the owners of oil and gas companies do not really include their opinions when they're thinking about how to develop workplace policies. And around 55% of those that we spoke with just feel like elected officials and local leaders do not really care about their opinions. So this is important because this study is highlighting what not only what their working conditions are, but we're offering some policy recommendations that are driven from our data. So Gabe, if you could advance the slide. So first off, it's really clear from our data that workforce training for workers will need to include English language and basic computer skills classes that are really going to be necessary to enable workers to engage in more focused workforce training. As Dr. Sanchez showed you in the studies, there's a high interest in workers partaking in specialized training in industries such as HVAC or electrician work. But an essential piece to getting there is to ensure that workers learn English and that they have more literacy in computer skills. So an important recommendation is that when we're thinking about how to support training in this region, that we think about it as something that exists across a continuum and that has to happen together, so that we're thinking more holistically about how to retrain this workforce so that we have a viable economy in the region. Our report also suggests that there will need to be braided funding to supplement the gaps in federal funds with state resources. As Dr. Sanchez noted, Title WIOA funds limit and restrict undocumented workers from accessing them. So in order to supplement workers, this report suggests that there may need to be funds emanating from state funders so that we can offset this gap and give resources to the oil workers who are undocumented immigrants who are basically holding up that economy. The study also suggests that as a whole, it's absolutely essential that we have coordination and collaboration across multiple sectors in the region in order to achieve full economic development. This ecosystem includes community colleges, labor unions, industry representatives, training or service providers, and community-based and worker organizations to offer support. Without strong coordinated efforts, we will risk creating a very fragmented system with limited funding for the core workforce of that region, undocumented immigrant workers. Thank you.
So with that, we'll turn it back over to Somos, who will allow us to hear directly from members of the workforce, which I think is the most useful part of our conversation to reinforce what you saw with the data.
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel Sanchez and Dr. Cheyenne Sanchez. And yes, we invite folks to read the full report, and we will also have an executive summary for you to read. For those who shared their contact information in the chat, we will make sure we share some of those links to those reports and our presentation from today. And so now next, we will hear directly, like Dr. Sanchez mentioned, we will hear directly from our community, our worker voices. Our first brave soul is Jose Antonio Perez. He is an oil worker from Artesia, New Mexico. Then we will hear from Jose Sanchez, who is an oil worker from Roswell, New Mexico. Mara Delgado, who's a former female oil worker from Hobbs, New Mexico, and Eric Saucedo, who's a former oil worker from Hobbs, New Mexico. So Jose Perez, once you're ready.
Good morning. I'll be reading on behalf of Jose Perez, who wasn't able to be on with us today. Hola, mi nombre es José, soy de Artesia, Nuevo México. Tengo 23 años viviendo aquí y he trabajado en la industria toda mi vida. Yo fui lesionado en el trabajo. El 50% de mi cuerpo fue quemado por causa de una explosión. Y no pensaron que iba a sobrevivir. La recuperación física fue de más de un año, pero la recuperación mental y emocional duró más. Tampoco tengo acceso a seguro médico o compensación por los accidentes. Después del accidente se me hizo difícil encontrar otro tipo de trabajo, ya que no hay capacitaciones disponibles para poder trabajar en otra industria o escalar las barreras del inglés para poder conseguir un mejor puesto en una compañía. A pesar de mucha búsqueda, tuve que regresar a la industria del gas y petróleo. Es importante para mí y otros trabajadores, incluyendo la comunidad del sureste, poder elevar nuestras vidas y encontrar trabajos de calidad que nos tomen en cuenta nuestras necesidades y deseos de tener una mejor calidad de vida. Una inversión significante para el desarrollo laboral en el sureste es una inversión para nuestras comunidades petroleras. Gracias.
Is Jose Sanchez available? Jose Sanchez, ¿puede presentar?
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es José Sánchez, oil worker from Roswell, New Mexico. Soy de Roswell, Nuevo México. Llevo viviendo aquí por 24 años y llevo más de 13 años trabajando en la industria del gas y petróleo. Tengo 3 hijos y mi mayor miedo es el riesgo que podamos morir en un accidente, ya que viajo 2 horas de venida hacia el trabajo y 2 de ida para venir a trabajar en el petróleo. No hay oportunidades para que podamos tomar otro tipo de capacitaciones para otros trabajos que no sean del gas y del petróleo. Los trabajos no son seguros y muchas veces las compañías no toman en cuenta la seguridad de sus empleados. El 40% del presupuesto estatal proviene de las lágrimas y sudor y las vidas de los trabajadores inmigrantes. Lo único que nosotros pedimos son trabajos de calidad con acceso a capacitación y que nuestros hijos tengan mejores oportunidades en el sureste de Nuevo México. Gracias a todos.
Gracias, Jose. Just a friendly reminder that we do have interpretation available for those who need it. On the bottom, you can scroll down to an interpretation globe, and Denise is happy to help you with that as well. And so ahora vamos a comenzar con Mara Delgado. who's a former female oil worker from Hobbs, New Mexico.
Hola, me llamo Mara Delgado. Bueno, la señora Mara Delgado no pudo estar hoy aquí, pero nosotros lo vamos a leer por ella. Hola, me llamo Mara Delgado. Tengo viviendo 3 años en Hobbs, Nuevo México. Tengo 2 niños. Soy madre soltera y trabajé en la Ferguson de servicios industriales. Yo era ayudante de soldador. Nomás trabajé con extremas temperaturas, además, pero también en horarios extremos que no me permitían pasar tiempo ni cuidar a mis hijos. Por eso el horario del trabajo no me conectaba con la guardería. Entonces decidí dejar mi trabajo para cuidar a mis niños y además era muy pesado para una mujer, incluyendo los malos sueldos que nos dan a las mujeres. Bueno, yo quisiera ver más oportunidades de trabajo para las mujeres como yo, que no tuvieron más opción que entrar en la industria peligrosa del petróleo. Actualmente estoy interesada en la carrera de soldadura y también otras opciones del trabajo que sean flexibles con mi horario para cuidar a mis hijos y que no sean tan pesados. Quisiera entrar en un programa que me dé acceso a capacitación y que me ayude a aprender habilidades mientras me apoyan con el cuidado de niños, para que pueda ejercer en una carrera como mujer y madre. Los invito a que lean sobre el estudio donde yo también participé con otros trabajadores del petróleo para compartir nuestras realidades en el suroeste y nuestras necesidades como trabajadores. Gracias.
Gracias. Ahora vamos a comenzar con Eric Saucedo, who's a former oil worker from Hobbs, New Mexico.
Hello, my name is Eric Salcedo. I have been living in Hobbs for 20 years of my life. I had to go to Albuquerque to look for career opportunities, leaving my family in Hobbs. I grew up with a petroleum family. My dad works in oil, and very often he has to move to other states because this industry is not stable. This has resulted in us spending very little to no quality time with the family. In my community, there's no variety of career opportunities, only related to oil and gas that I don't like. That's why I had to move away from my family. Recently, I had to return to Hobbs to work in the oil industry because I don't want to be away from them, and because there are no other job options in the Southeast. However, I recently had an accident on the job. A pipe fell on my leg, severely injuring me. Without having any benefits, I decided to leave, and I'm currently unemployed and recovering from the accident. The state needs to invest in our communities and young people so we can have more quality jobs and careers. It is not fair that our families have to pay with our health and safety and often their lives in order to have a job and provide for their families. We are the economic drivers of the state's economy, yet we are the most forgotten. Thank you for hearing us.
Thank you, Eric. Ahora vamos a comenzar con Leonardo Botello, who is a former oil worker from Hobbs, New Mexico.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Leonardo Botello. Tengo viviendo en Hobbs 21 años. Tengo 8 hijos. Trabajé en la industria del petróleo por 19 años. Hace poco me retiré. Me gustaría ver más variedad de nuevos trabajos de calidad que se nos tomaran en cuenta a las personas como yo, que trabajamos muchos años en la industria instable en muy peligrosas e injustas condiciones, porque a mí como padre no me gustaría que mis hijos siguieran trabajando en estos trabajos tan peligrosos y que no tengan oportunidades de escalar posiciones como yo, que trabajé en la misma posición de peligrosa por años. Por eso la importancia de que el Estado invierta en más trabajos de calidad, seguros y con escalas para crecer y más importante con entrenamiento para nuestras comunidades rurales y olvidadas. Gracias.
Gracias, Leonardo. Now we're going to continue off with questions. So if anybody from our media guests have any questions, please provide it in the chat below, and we will be happy to answer some of those questions. We will also later on are happy to coordinate with you all, and we do have the contact information of some of our guest speakers today, and we are happy to connect you all with them as well.